Hello everybody, Loremaster Sotek here, back with your daily dose of the Ogre Kingdom's Q&A, which just as a reminder, today is Friday, which means there will not be a new episode tomorrow or Sunday, because we're going to be doing just this on the weekdays, but I will have some new stuff for you guys on Saturday and Sunday respectively, so be sure to check back tomorrow for those. I really think you're going to like them. We might talk about them a little bit at the end here. But let's go ahead and jump into our first question today from Joachim Schipper. How can the interaction of the Ogre Kingdoms with the rest of the Warhammer races be described? Are there any famous clashes or alliances, and do they trade with other races? I would say that the best way to describe the Ogre Kingdoms and how they interact with everybody else is that they are opportunistic bullies. So if they think that they can get away with pushing somebody around or forcing them to do something they don't want to do, they will probably take advantage of that. But if they think that that enemy might be better off as a trade partner instead, or could potentially be stronger than them to the extent that it would be too much effort to fight them, then they'll kind of back off and purely act as more of an ally. That's kind of how their relationship with the Chaos Dwarves developed, because when the Ogres and the Chaos Dwarves originally met, they actually battled frequently with one another in what was known as the Ash Wars, but the Ogres lost that war just because they couldn't assault the Chaos Dwarfs cities, which mainly are the capital of Zarnagron, but there are a couple of famous defensive towers and stuff that the Chaos Dwarves have scattered around the place, like the Black Fortress, and the Ogres just could not get through those defenses, and it basically came to the point where they established a friendlier relationship of trade by bullying other people because it just wasn't worth the effort of trying to kill the Chaos Dwarves. Next up, we've got Demoter Hurlmort. How does Ogre magic work? Do they need to eat something to be more powerful, or is it basically the use of just the winds of magic? It's a combination of both, though leaning much more on the having to eat things side. In order to cast magic from the lore of the Great Maw, a butcher or a slaughtermaster has to eat something they have to consume a specific type of ingredient in order to invoke the proper aspect of the Great Maw's eternal hunger. So for instance, if they're wanting to cast a spell like, there's a spell called Brain Gobbler, or Brain something, I think it's Brain Gobbler, but they literally will take out like a skull or the head of something, and they'll eat it or eat its brains or something. And by doing that, they invoke a property of the Great Maw that causes the magic to impact literally the minds of their opponents. But all of their spells require them to eat something, and the properties of whatever it is they're eating is going to have a very dramatic impact on the spell being cast. So generally, they know what they're doing. Like, butchers and slaughtermasters don't operate based on instinct. They have like an academic type knowledge about whatever it is they're going to eat and the impact it will have. But they are, that's why they tend to carry around like massive amounts of ingredients with them, either on their person or carried around by their noblars. And they also tend to have like big cauldrons dragged to the battlefields, either by, you know, Rhinox or by lots of Noblars, or they'll pull them themselves. But, yeah, they're always prepared. And of course, they'll work with what they get on the battlefield. You know, a butcher that's fighting, or a slaughtermaster that's fighting, usually the way they'll end up casting their magic is they'll either have what they need on their person strapped to their body, or like if they're fighting you, you know, they'll reach in and like grab you by your arm and like chop your arm off and eat it to cast a spell. Which of course is very unfortunate if you're fighting against them. They're able to work on the go pretty well. But of course they do require the winds of magic. You know, if the winds of magic are dead, then they're not going to be able to cast any spells. Alright, then we've got a whole list of questions here from Matthew Pena, but most of these I can answer pretty quick, so we're just going to start going through them quick as we can. First question, are there any other notable Ogre Kingdoms characters besides the one in the 8th edition rulebook? Yes. We've already talked extensively about Gark Ironskin in past episodes. But the other one that's really worth looking into is Braw the Slave Lord, which you can really just Google him. But Braw the Slave Lord is a ogre who was captured by a necromancer. And basically the necromancer, if I recall correctly, his intent was to starve Braw out. He kept him in a cell. And his goal was to basically starve him to death until he could either make him weak enough to do experimentation on, or he could kill him through starvation and then use his corpse to create some kind of horrible undead abomination. But the necromancer goofed up and thought that Braw was weaker than he was. So when the necromancer approached him in his cage to basically either assess that he was still alive or start working on him, Braw basically like lunged at him and grabbed him, and the necromancer started to cast a really big, powerful spell in order to kill him and protect himself. But Braw ate him while he was casting that magic, and basically all of that necromantic dark energy was accidentally devoured by him in that moment, in addition to just all of it coursing through the necromancer's veins. And he basically, his stomach just kind of absorbed all of it, and it sort of turned Braw the Slave Lord into a nexus of necromantic energy. So wherever he goes, he just kind of constantly has like an aura that's giving off this kind of radiation that resurrects the dead around him and gives him control over them. So what he does is he just wanders around killing people, but he likes to look for battlefields where he will resurrect all of the dead, and then he chains them up and has them follow him as like this big slave train, which is why he's called the Slave Lord. And what he does is he runs around to collect tons and tons of these dead people, and he'll reanimate all their corpses and then take them to like the Chaos Dwarves and sell all of them to the Chaos Dwarves, because apparently they maintain their animation even when he's not super duper close. So he's actually an extremely powerful character because he can have undead legions around him, but he cannot actively control it. Like, he's not able to cast magic actively. He really just seems to radiate. He's kind of like Luther Harkin in that sense, except for Luther Harkin is more like the winds of magic, but he's like a vortex of it. So Luther Harkin absorbs the winds of magic to the point that he's basically immune to it, but he resurrects the dead around him. Whereas the Slave Lord is not quite that extreme, but is a similar situation. Second question. We already answered that, but it's about ogres and the way Games Workshop interpreted their skin color. We already answered that, I think, in the first or second episode. Third question. Any other major incursions into the Mountains of Morn besides the Tarmakon invasion? Yes, there are two super famous invasions that are worth talking about outside of Tarmakon. The first isn't strictly a single invasion. It's more of a place where invasions happen all the time. And it's, if you look at the Mountains of Morn, they kind of, like, if this is the Chaos Waste, there's kind of a point where the Mountains of Morn will go up and then it sort of indents and then it kind of comes back around. So there's this little gap where there's a single little, I don't want to call it a mountain, but it's this big stone out by itself. From, like, there are hundreds of miles where there's nothing around it. And it's called the Challenge Stone. And basically it's this really massive piece of rock that the Ogre Kingdoms and the Warriors of Chaos fight over all the time. Like, one of them is always in control of it. It's never a neutral territory. And basically, the ogres tend to maintain most control over it most of the time, but the ogres love it to try and bait the Warriors of Chaos down. So what'll usually happen is some big champion will take over like a notable amount of a Chaos army. And whenever a champion of Chaos builds up enough of a warband, they have to invade something. Like they basically, like, kind of the laws of Chaos dictate that in order to maintain their control over their army, they need to invade something to further cement their well-being in the eyes of the Dark Gods, whether they're trying to pursue demonhood or just trying to get an even larger horde. And so, some of them will invade the realm of Chaos to try and go fight the demons to prove how awesome they are. Some of them will attack each other. Some of them will attack famous Chaos fortresses. Some of them will attack Nagaroth. Some of them will attack Cathay. Some of them will attack Kislev or the Empire. There's lots of places they can go, or Ulthuan or Bretonia or whatever. But Some of the ones that are looking for a much quicker route, even though it is debatably the most dangerous, will go after the challenge stone. And the reason is because they know they're going to get a response. And because the challenge stone, when it's not being actively fought over, literally has like a set of lookout towers built into it where like a horde of Noblars live. And that's just their job. Like the ogres take really good care of these Noblars for them to just watch over the challenge stone. And they have like this big old lookout tower where they just look for chaos hordes. And as soon as they see one, they immediately start, they basically do the whole like the beacons from the third Lord of the Rings movie, where they just start blowing these really loud horns and they send out messengers, and then they start like lighting signal fires and stuff. And every ogre tribe in the northern mountains will just immediately start invading towards the challenge stone to go fight the chaos army. And it's just this big fight that happens every couple of years. And both sides love it. Like for the Warriors of Chaos, it's like the ultimate challenge. If they can win the challenge stone and take it for a while, A, they know that the ogres will keep coming, and B, to win the challenge stone is like a big deal in the eyes of the Dark Gods, because especially, I mean, for any of the Dark Patrons, it's a good show off, but for Khorne especially. And then, but the most recent invasion of the Mountains of Morn, besides the Tarmakon escapade, was actually a Tomb King. So the biggest invasion was led by the Crimson King, who is Imrothapis of Numis. So the Tomb City of Numis actually has like a really fast route that they take to get to the Ogre Kingdoms, because they're able to go through the, we talked about a few episodes ago, but there's like a Valley of Kings, and if they go through there, they can basically cut through the mountains near Nagashazar, and that'll take them to the Darklands, and then they can just shoot straight over to the Mountains of Morn. And he did that, and he actually had, the Crimson King had a very successful invasion. He curb stomped everything between him and the Mountains of Morn, and he started invading the Mountains of Morn with the intention of conquering it. So he wasn't just like trying to get back an artifact, which is usually the case. He was actually claiming territory and expanding the borders of Numis, and he was unstoppable. And the way the ogres finally beat him was that one of the tribes they realized they had no chance. He was just curb stomping every single ogre tribe that got near him, and he successfully conquered some of the southern World's Edge Mountains until he made a very fatal mistake of, he basically got his entire army, which included a lot of statuary. So he had a lot of Ushabti, he had a lot of Necrosphinxes, Cimmerian War Sphinxes, Necrofex Colossi, which is the technical term for, not Necrofex, that's the Vampire Coast one, but there's I'm blanking on it, but there's a technical term for bone giants. But he had like a ton of these things, all constructs, and they got lured into going through this massive valley that was very long but pretty narrow. And what the ogres did is they basically lured him into it, and then they had an entire herd, like we're talking hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of Rhinox, which are our world's version of the megafauna, the ancient distant ancestor of our rhinoceros, which are huge, but they're even bigger because Warhammer Fantasy, and they just like slapped all their butts and just sent them down into this valley. So it was a huge stampede of these colossal monsters that just obliterated the Crimson King's army and killed him. So he just died, and his army was completely wiped out, and that was the end of his invasion. Next question. How dependent are the Ogre Kingdoms on their food source? Is it sustainable in the Mountains of Morn, and is there a food limiting factor to the expansion of their territory? So, interesting thing on that is that that's actually addressed in the Ogre Kingdom's timeline. Ogres are very, very reliant on having a sustainable food source. That's why a lot of tribes go raiding, is because either they realize that they need to pick up a new source of food due to like a harsh winter preventing them from going into the upper peaks, or they need to like raid a particularly nasty mountain that's known for having a lot of megafauna, like big monsters and scary stuff like that. But generally ogres are fine in the Mountains of Morn because there are so many large monsters and great herds of large monsters like Rhinox and Mornfangs and stuff, that they, as long as they're able to win those battles, they will have virtually unlimited food source. Granted, it's dangerous and a lot of ogres will die, but if anything, that just stretches out their food source. That being said, until recently, the ogres believed that they had an unlimited source of food in the Mountains of Morn. But when Grease's Goldtooth took over, he did such a good job of basically getting the Ogre Kingdoms back under the control of a single authority figure that he was able to cause their population to explode by getting them to stop infighting. And he also kind of Greases was the one who was responsible for forcing all of Ogre kind. He basically did an education program. I'm not even kidding. Greases literally like advanced Ogre civilization because he did an education program where all the ogres recognize gold as being equivalent to red meat when it comes to trade. But he basically instituted a series of reforms that allowed the ogres to be much more successful at what they're doing. They work together more, and because of that, their population exploded to the point that over the course of about 50 or 60 years, that basically, or more like 40 years, but basically made it so that the ogres are now getting to the point where it's unsustainable for them to be in the Mountains of Morn, and Greases figured that out. Greases is actually very, very smart for an ogre. And, well, he's pretty smart in general, but he's very, very clever. And he's surprisingly capable of doing very advanced mathematics. No small part due to his crown, which actually makes him smarter, because it's a really, really potent artifact. But he essentially realized that they were getting to the point where he has a crown literally called the Over Tyrant's crown, and it's a massive crown that was forged by the Empire in exchange for a ton of money that makes Greases like as smart as a normal person, but with an ogre's drive. But he basically did a lot of pretty complicated mathematics to figure out that the ogres would not be able to be sustainable in their current growing population. And he was considering doing a new invasion, and then the Firemouth erupted. And the Firemouth, which we've talked about, is one of the ogre's gods. Ever since it was recognized as their deity a couple thousand years ago, the ogres take it as, ever since the very first Over Tyrant, which the first Over Tyrant was named Thug the Fist, and he was the one to recognize the Firemouth as a deity, and he was the one that started the practice of, if the Firemouth erupts, that means you have to invade. Like, that is your god calling you to war, so you have to launch an invasion. And so when Greases figured out that all this stuff was going on, the Firemouth erupts, and he was like, perfect. So he called out to all the tribes and said, okay, it's go time. We need a full invasion. Everybody's getting together. I don't care what direction you go, but you have to invade, and you have to claim new territory for the Ogre Kingdoms. And virtually all of them decided, okay, we're going west. And that started what's called the Great Migration, which is what just started happening in the end times. Because all the mountains started erupting. Or all the volcanoes. Next question. What is the truth about the Great Maw? We've already talked about that, about like what it is. But just a quick recap. It's basically the largest warpstone meteor that's ever been recorded, with the exception of the Chaos Moon itself, which is a meteor because it never impacted the planet, but it's, like a giant hunk of warpstone. But it was a massive amount of warpstone that Cathay basically grabbed out of space and threw at the ogres because the Celestial Emperor was pissed at them. But it kind of sort of backfired. Like, it did its job, but it kind of backfired because being a colossal hunk of basically solidified magic, when it killed over 2/3 of the ogre population, it kind of absorbed a lot of their... It was very heavily influenced by their deep emotional existence. And so it essentially transformed into being a reflection of the ogres and became their god. And it turned into a colossal entity that ate its way. It's basically just a mouth with no stomach. Like, it's just a mouth all the way through that's filled with teeth and flesh and just devours anything and everything. Like, presumably, maybe it has a stomach, but I'm not sure where it's located. Maybe at the absolute core of the planet. But it ate its way through the entire planet. So when it impacted the planet, it resides where we know the Great Maw is, which it's huge. Like, this thing is massive. And it ate its way through the entire planet, and after about, I want to say after 2 or 3 years, it came out the other side. Not the meteor, because the meteor turned into the Great Maw. But it basically devoured its way through the planet and surfaced in the ocean on the other side, which, because it was like a giant warpstone entity at that point, the ocean not only cooled it off so that it turned into its current form, but it turned into a vortex that boiled the ocean, killing tons of things and people. And it also turned into a big maelstrom, which we now know as the where Count Noctilus hangs out. So when you play Total War Warhammer on Vortex or Mortal Empires, that the Galleon's Graveyard, which is Count Noctilus's home base, if you play on the map and you get to see that massive vortex behind him, that's the Great Maw. But it's the other side of it. But it's a mouth on both ends, because it's terrifying. Next question: how do we get Chaos Ogres? You join Chaos. Very simple. Question 7: can Ogre Kingdom Tyrants be great generals? For Ogre Tyrants to be great generals, do they have to purely have brute force, or can they have levels of cunning and strategy? A mix. An ogre who is purely just really, really powerful, but is like a complete idiot, likely is not going to be Tyrant for very long. And that has to do with the fact that ogres have to constantly innovate in order to survive, because they are not the apex predator in their ecosystem. You know, if an ogre tyrant is like freakishly powerful, but is an idiot, then more than likely he is going to do something that's going to get him killed, because there are creatures that no singular ogre, I don't care how strong the ogre is. Like, even Grease's Goldtooth wielding the Scepter of the Sky Titans, which makes him one of the strongest entities in Warhammer Fantasy, he would get curb stomped by some of the singular monsters in the Mountains of Morn. It takes an entire tribe of ogres, or sometimes many tribes of ogres, in order to defeat those creatures. So while brute strength is appreciated among ogre kind, it's not the biggest deal. And sooner or later he's going to die. To be one of the greatest generals in Ogre Kingdom society, you have to be clever. You have to know how to utilize your army successfully. All of the really famous ogres in ogre history are not famous because of how strong they were. They're famous because they innovated somehow. Like, there's some of the most famous ones are, there was an ogre tyrant who grew really, really famous because he actually took down one of the only dwarf holds that was impenetrable in the Mountains of Morn by realizing that the ogres could not take it down because it had a bunch of lookout towers filled with siege artillery that would just rip them apart if they tried to attack it. So he went out on a journey and forcibly enslaved 12 giants, and then brought them to the battle because the giants were so powerful they were able to just destroy these towers, and they allowed the ogres to smash through the gates of the dwarf fortress and destroy it. But during the battle, he got shot in the stomach with a dwarf cannon, which didn't kill him, but it basically made it impossible for him to eat for a week. And he was so like traumatized by that experience that he created the Lookout Noblar, which is the process of having a Noblar on your shoulder that says, hey, shit, somebody's shooting at us. And so you can not get hit. And that's what made him really famous, was the Lookout Noblar. You know, Greasus is very, very famous, not because he's a brute, but because he killed brutes. You know, Greasus killed, he defeated his father fair and square. But, like, there was another ogre tyrant he fought who was much bigger than him, and we talked about it. He gut slammed him by jumping off the edge of the challenge pit while the other ogre was waiting for him to climb down. Greasus didn't climb down. He just jumped off and body slammed him, snapping his neck. And there was, like, another challenge where there was a tribe that was much more powerful and rich than Greasus' own tribe at the time, the Goldtooth tribe. So the way Greasus dealt with them is he went up into the peaks above their valley, and he started shouting and screaming to cause an avalanche that buried the entire tribe and killed them. So, like, being clever is much more important than being strong among ogres, but you do have to be strong. Otherwise, you're probably not going to be able to survive the constant challenges that you're going to get dealt. You need to be able to eat. That's the real thing. You need to be, like, fat. Next question. We already answered that one, but it has to do with, like, do they have major allies and stuff like that. Ninth question. How are Gorgers controlled and directed outside the Mountains of Morn? I thought they were feral cave ambushers. Okay, so Gorgers are whack in the lore when it comes to like how they're created and how they manifest. So let's actually talk about them in depth for a minute. So the way you create a Gorger and how they're utilized is that when a baby is born to an ogre tribe, if it's not born looking strong, it has some kind of mutation, or it doesn't have a ogre signature paunch, so it doesn't have a gut, they will give it to the tribe's butcher, and he will take it down to a cave underneath the ogre tribes, like at the bottom of the valley. And this cave is always sealed by like a massive boulder, so the ogres will roll the boulder back, the baby will get chucked inside, and they roll it back into place and just leave the baby there to die. But what happens is that some of the babies are basically so full of vitality that they refuse to die, and they'll start crawling around and just eating whatever they can. And over the years, they begin to grow. But the problem with the Mountains of Morn is that a lot of the tunnels underneath the Mountains of Morn, and this is why there tend to be so many Skaven in the Mountains of Morn, are filled with warpstone. Like, there are warpstone crystals everywhere. And these babies are so desperate that they'll eat anything they can get their hands on. You know, from rats to worms, insects, other babies they might come across, anything. And they learn to specialize in stealth. You know, they become these creepy cave dweller troglodyte-like things that have big sinewy muscles, but they start to eat the warpstone. And that causes them to mutate a lot. And they basically get these creepy mutations that turn them into these freakish, long-limbed beings that are blind, essentially. Like, they're not completely blind. They have actually very good dark vision or low light vision, but they're functionally blind in sunlight. But they come to rely very much on their sense of smell, but they all get very similar mutations that are terrifying. Once again, calling back to the SCP-096. I got it right this time. In that all Gorgers can distend their jaws, so they're able to unhinge their jaw completely and just stretch it open to horrific lengths. It's noted that Gorgers can actually eat things that are larger than themselves, and then they'll just kind of sit and digest it for a while. So they're like snakes, except for a lot scarier, and, you know, being like 8 feet tall or 10 feet tall or whatever it is, that because they actually tend to be stretchier and bigger than ogres, so they're actually more in like the 12-foot plus ballpark. But on top of that, Gorgers have the ability to compress their bodies into terrifyingly small spaces. So Gorgers can basically squeeze through holes that are way too small for them, as long as like I forget, there's not like a particular organ noted, but their bones are able to be slightly compressed. So if you ever watched a cat like squish into a space where you're like, that shouldn't have worked, but it did, that's a Gorger. So like, you might think you're safe because you have, you know, got into an opening that's super thin and you were barely able to fit through it, and a Gorger could fit through it and chase you. And that's actually why Gorgers are the biggest nightmare source possible for Skaven and dwarves, because dwarf holds will have like a crack in their walls or a crack in the tunnel, or the Skaven will have like a really small tunnel that only, you know, fairly large but still tiny compared to Skaven giant rats can fit through, and a freaking Gorger will squeeze through that shit and start just eating everybody. Like, they're terrifying monsters. But the way the ogres actually use them is ogres are pretty smart when it comes to Gorgers. Now, some, like Scrag the Slaughterer can actually summon Gorgers, because Scrag the Slaughterer actually fought a king of Gorgers, which was like the biggest, nastiest Scourger that's ever been known to exist, and Scrag just ate him. But Scrag Scrag brute forced the Gorgers that he was entombed with until they recognized him as Alpha, and now they just follow him around. But usually how Ogre summon them is when they're going to war, a tyrant will go down and roll the boulder out of the way, and he'll do one of two things. He'll basically throw a lot of carcasses and fresh meat and blood in front of the cave mouth to lure all the Gorgers to the entrance, and then depending on the tribe's tactics, if they tend to be a much more controlling tribe or they have a lot of hunters, then what they'll do in that case is they will lay traps for the Gorgers. So when the Gorgers come out and start eating all of the stuff that the Ogres have lured them out with, they will spring traps and attack the Gorgers to beat them up and knock them out, or force them into cages, and then they put blindfolds on them and they drag them to wherever they want to use them. And then before the battlefield starts, they'll basically aim the cages in the direction of the enemy, so that they're the only thing the Gorgers will see when they take their blindfolds off, and then they just let them go. And the Gorgers go blind in sunlight, but they don't need to see. Gorgers have such an absurd level of such an absurd sense of smell and hearing that they can purely operate on that to run around battlefields and eat people. And what if a tribe does not have a lot of hunters and doesn't want to bother with capturing them, or they don't want to wait for the Gorgers, what they'll do in that case is the tribe's butcher will basically just carve up a lot of meat, and they'll just leave a trail that leads from the Gorgers' cave all the way to the enemy's encampment, so that the Gorger will just show up and start attacking people, which either way is a nightmare scenario for the enemy. Next question, 10. Are Yetis intelligent? Why or how do they work with Ogre Kingdoms? Yes, they are intelligent. They have their own kind of pseudo-society, though they're definitely, like, they roam. But there are, like, kings of the Yetis. But we've already talked about them in depth, that basically the Ogre Tyrant has a horn they can blow, and it will basically summon the Yetis to war. This seems mostly to be due to just the Yetis recognizing the Ogres as allies / cousins. But the Yetis do get stuff out of it, because they, of course, get a ton of meat and food by devouring their enemies. So for the Yetis, it's kind of a win-win scenario, and they don't want to fight the Ogres. It's just not worth it for them. And then the last question from him is there anything Ogres will not eat? Nope, they will eat anything. If it's made of meat, they will try it, no matter what. If it's not made of meat, they would only really try it if they were desperate, or if they were like, it was moving, so, like, I'll try. Like, you can find Ogres that have, like, tried to eat tree men and stuff like that, and they probably don't think it's that bad. But Ogres do definitely tend to prefer roasting forest spirits and then eating the elves over the roast. And then he does have a PS here about, is there any notable stories about the Ogre Kingdoms in Cathay? Yes, Cathay caused the Ogre Kingdoms, but we've already talked about that way in depth in prior episodes. All right, the last question, because we're over time. The last question for today is from Gabriel. Actually, we'll do two more, because there's one question I actually do want to talk about. So the second to last question from Gabriel Perella is, are ogres capable of interpersonal relationships, or do their Darwinist beliefs of survival of the fittest and might makes right prevent that? There are interpersonal relationships among ogres. There are ogres that seem to have loved ones, whether they are siblings or lovers or friends. That being said, ogres are purely, at a fundamental level, driven by their need and desire to eat and to dominate, and they will not allow those interpersonal relationships to stop them from furthering their own drive. So, you know, when ogres have children, there is very little love between fathers and sons, or daughters and mothers and stuff like that. Like, it is very normal in ogre culture for you to supplant and kill your parents. That's just like what happens a lot of the time. That being said, it doesn't really seem to be viewed poorly. It's just expected. But fratricide is fairly rare, unless your brother or sibling is tyrant, in which case it's not unexpected to challenge them. But if once an ogre is tyrant, their iron guts tend to be very loyal. And that's usually because the tyrant will take very good care of them. but bruisers, which in ogre society, the kind of the list is you have tyrants at the top, followed by bruisers, who are kind of their enforcers and are like the commanders. Then you have iron guts, who make the elite, who are the elite bodyguard for the bruisers and tyrants. And then you have your bulls. Ogre bulls are like the base version. And generally, iron guts are exceedingly loyal to their tyrants. And tribes are very loyal to their tyrants. Like a tribe, it is not considered disloyalty or like bad to challenge your tyrant. It's just seen as the strongest needs to lead the tribe, and it's not viewed in a negative light. But like if an outsider shows up and challenges your tyrant, that usually can cause some like raised eyebrows. Like when Greasus decided to become over tyrant, a lot of tribes were not cool with that because there had not been an over tyrant in 100 years. And so Greasus had to go through like basically a Heracles situation where he had to perform like a long series of feats to prove himself capable of being over tyrant, because tribes are so interloyal among themselves and they genuinely love one another that they will back each other up against any outside threat. And when Greasus would show up and kill the tyrant of a tribe, all of the Iron Guts and Bruisers were like, let's fucking go. Like, they would fight Greasus. Granted, they would have to do it by Ogre Kingdom laws, which means they had to fight him one at a time, but then Greasus just proved, I'm bigger and stronger than all of you guys. And once he sufficiently proved that, all the ogres were like, alright, we were wrong. We're going to fall in line now. And they didn't hold it against Greasus. They just acknowledged, he's the biggest and baddest. We should have been following him from the beginning. Now we understand that. So it's kind of a mix. You know, it's not like humans, where humans, if an outside guy came and just proved he was unbeatable, but he still killed all your loved ones to prove it because they kept challenging him, humans would hold a grudge. Ogres, they don't really deal with that. So, there you go. And then, the last question I want to talk about today is Scrag. And that's just because I love Scrag, and this question was fun to answer. So, Jawalalu asks, what is Scrag the Slaughterer relationship with the other Ogre Kingdom's legendary lords and tyrants? So, fun fact is that, so for those who don't know Scrag the Slaughterer, you should Google him because his model is really cool. And he's actually, his model is still active in Age of Sigmar, which actually makes him fairly unique among the Ogre characters, because most of their models got retired going into Age of Sigmar, but Scrag the Slaughterer is still usable as a model. Granted, he's not Scrag, he's just like a generic thing now. But Scrag was, Scrag's a big deal. He is like if Greasus is the, you know, the emperor, the king, whatever, then Scrag is like the Fey Enchantress or the Ever Queen. Like, he's the religious figure, and he's the Volkmar the Grim. You know, he's the big deal in the magic and religion sphere, which are the same in ogre culture. When Scrag took over, I'll rephrase that. When Scrag murdered his own tribe after they tried to exile him, which they succeeded, but the problem was he survived the exile and came back leading an army of Gorgers and killed everyone. But Scrag is so scary that he doesn't have a tribe, because no tribe would dare try to claim him, because that would be viewed as an insult to him. He is the prophet of the Great Maw. He is the Great Maw. He is literally known as the Maw that walks, because all he does is he's kind of gotten super insane to the point that he doesn't really go anywhere with a direct sense of purpose. He simply follows his gut because he believes it's the Great Maw telling him where it wants him to go, and he's correct. The Great Maw, the entity, is actually influencing his behavior. So whenever the ogres start fighting in a war or a battle, the Great Maw is drawn to it because it's like, you know, it's a big cycle of violence and it's the source of the best meat. So Scrag, whenever violence is happening that involves ogres, he knows about it and he starts heading in that direction, as long as it's sufficiently large and he can get there in time. And Scrag is viewed as basically the Grombrindal of the ogres, in that nobody knows where he is a lot of the time, and if he shows up, it's like a big religious event, and he curb stomps everybody. Like, if Scrag shows up and you're the ogres, you're like, oh shit, God is here. Like, like Jesus has showed up, and he just butchers his way through the army. because the Great Maw favors him so heavily that he's able to dish out blessings like it's going out of style on all of his allies. Plus, you have somewhere between, on average, 20 to 100 Gorgers following behind him that show up a little ways after him. So, like, if you're trying to fight Scrag, you're already fighting a huge Ogre army. And then on top of that, this prophet shows up who's throwing around magic and overwhelming your wizards like it's no big problem. And he's buffing the shit out of the ogres. So they're getting way tougher, hardier, they're healing wounds. And then all of a sudden, a big fucking army of terrifying monsters show up from all directions because they're ambush predators. And they just swarm you from every direction. You like, you're fucked. Like, there's no way to survive a Scrag attack without like a legendary character in your ranks. And as far as how the other characters view him, Grease's Goldtooth, who is the over tyrant and the ultimate authority in greenskin culture, is vaguely scared of Scrag. Like, not in the sense that he is like, oh shit, Scrag. He's more kind of like, whoa, this guy, like, this guy is the Great Maw. So everybody respects Scrag and nobody tries to boss him around. And it has a lot to do with the fact that he's crazy. But all of the tyrants, including Greasus being the over-tyrant, are scared enough of Scrag that they consider him the authority figure in Ogre Kingdom's culture. Nobody would ever consider fighting him or touching him, just because he's their god made manifest. That being said, you know, because Scrag is insane, he's not a power player, he's not interested in politics, he doesn't talk to anybody. You know, Scrag doesn't show up and he's like, this is the tactic we're going to use and I'm in control. You know, he doesn't bother with that. Scrag just shows up and he's like slicing and dicing people to throw into his pot. And Scrag kind of has his own army in that he travels and there's like a ton of Noblars that travel with him. And of course, at a notable distance, there's a horde of Gorgers that are always following him around. But, yeah, Scrag is nuts. he's a great character. But, yeah, the other legendary lords would not mess with him. And, you know, in the apocalyptic scenario, which is what's happening in modern lore right before the end times, when Greasus basically unifies all the ogres and marches west, you know, Greasus is the general. He's in charge. But Scrag is definitely there somewhere. So, anyway, hope you guys enjoyed this video. We ran super far over time, but I think you'll be okay with that, and hopefully that'll make up for this video coming out late today. So, thank you all for watching. I will be back tomorrow with a new video that I hope you guys will like. And then on Sunday, I'm going to be releasing another new video that I'm personally really excited. I'm going to be trying to pitch a DLC idea for the Total War series, for Total War Warhammer series. And I hope you guys will like that. So, see you then, guys.